Lena Morris always thought spring smelled like new beginnings until the night she found pale, human teeth growing among the basement flowers. It was the first warm week of spring when I decided to clean out the basement. The winter had been long and suffocating, and the idea of opening the dusty old space beneath the house felt like a way to clear my head. The air outside was fresh, carrying the scent of wet soil and blooming trees, but the basement was heavy with a damp, stale odor that clung to my clothes the moment I stepped inside. The light from the small ground-level windows barely reached the far walls, leaving most of the space in shadow. I worked methodically, moving boxes that hadn't been touched in years, brushing off cobwebs, and stacking useless junk to be thrown away. As I dragged an old trunk across the floor, I noticed something odd in the far corner, something that didn't belong. There, in a patch of dim light, was a cluster of small flowers. They shouldn't have been there. The basement floor was solid concrete, cracked in places, but completely cut off from soil or sunlight. Yet somehow, these delicate stems had pushed up through a thin fracture in the ground. They were pale, almost white, their petals soft-looking and slightly translucent. The longer I stared at them, the stranger they seemed. Each flower had a faint shimmer, as though a thin layer of dew was permanently clinging to it. They didn't sway in the stillness of the basement, but as I stepped closer, I thought I saw the tiniest movement in the stems, like a subtle shift toward me. The crack they grew from was wider than it first appeared. It wasn't just a hairline fracture, it was a jagged opening, no wider than a few inches but stretching deep into the floor. I crouched down and peered inside. The darkness there was thick and absolute, but the faint smell rising from it made me recoil. It wasn't the clean, earthy scent of fresh soil. It was sharp, metallic, and sour. The kind of smell that makes you think of rust or something long dead. I hesitated, my curiosity fighting with the unease creeping into my stomach. I reached out toward the nearest flower, thinking I might pull one up to see the roots. But before I touched it, the basement light flickered. A quick blink, just enough to throw me into shadow for less than a second. That's when I heard it. It was faint at first, barely louder than the soft hum of the old refrigerator upstairs. A slow, steady sound, deep and hollow. It took me a moment to understand what it was, the sound of breathing. Not my own. I froze, my hand suspended above the petals. The light steadied again, and my heart kicked hard against my ribs. I glanced at the crack. The flowers were different now. Their stems had all tilted toward me, their blossoms facing the same direction, as though straining to reach me. It was impossible, but I could see it with my own eyes. Their movement hadn't been random. My knees felt weak, but I forced myself to lean closer, telling myself it was just a trick of the mind. That's when I saw something lodged between the roots. At first I thought it was a pebble, but it caught the light in a way that stone wouldn't, and my stomach churned when I realized what it was. A human tooth. It was stained yellow and streaked with something black and sticky, the same substance that coated the edges of the crack. My first instinct was to back away, but the breathing sound was growing louder now, pulsing in time with the flowers. Each inhalation seemed to make their petals widen, revealing delicate, glistening veins inside. The air felt heavier, pressing down on my chest. I took a step back, then another, but my eyes stayed locked on the crack. The darkness within it didn't seem empty anymore. It felt like something was down there, close enough to be just beneath the surface, listening to my movements, matching my breathing. The flowers trembled, their petals twitching like the muscles of something alive. The tooth shifted slightly, as if whatever was beneath had moved. I gripped the railing of the basement stairs, every instinct telling me to get out, but before I could turn away, the light flickered again. The breathing stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the sound itself. And then, from deep in that narrow crack, something exhaled, damp air that brushed against my ankle like the breath of something waiting to climb up. Spring break had just started, and I was eager to escape the noise of the city. I packed my car with the bare essentials tent sleeping bag, a small cooler, and drove out to a lakeside campground I'd visited many times before. By summer, the place would be crowded with families, boats, and the smell of grilled food drifting through the air. But in early spring, it was always quieter. I expected a few scattered campers, maybe a fisherman or two. When I pulled in, the silence was immediate. The gravel road crunched under my tires, but there was no other movement. Every campsite I passed was empty. The picnic tables damp from recent rain, fire pits filled with cold ash. Even the office at the entrance was locked, the sign swinging gently in the breeze. It felt strange, but not yet unsettling. I told myself I'd have the whole place to myself, a rare luxury. I set my tent near the edge of the lake, close enough to hear the soft splash of water on the shore. The sun was still high, and the light sparkled on the surface like glass. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the smell of pine trees and wet earth. I set up my tent, hammered the stakes into the ground, and built a small fire to keep away the evening chill. As the sun went down, the forest grew completely still. No birds sang, no leaves moved. The quiet felt almost heavy. I ate a quick meal and climbed into my sleeping bag. The tent's thin fabric let the cold in, but I was too tired to care. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps, slow, careful, close. I knew right away they were human steps. My eyes opened, staring at the faint outline of the tent walls. The steps crunched on the gravel path, stopping every few seconds, like whoever or whatever it was kept listening. I stayed still, my heart pounding. The sound began circling my tent, once, twice, each time faster, closer. My breathing became shallow, every part of me wanting to stay quiet. I grabbed my flashlight, holding it tightly. The thin tent wall felt like no protection at all, but I had to look. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The cold night air hit me. The footsteps stopped. The campsite was empty under the moonlight. My fire was out, and shadows stretched across the ground. I stepped out fully, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. The only sound was the faint ripple of the lake. Then I saw them deep footprints in the gravel, leading away from my tent toward the shore. I followed them, the air growing colder the closer I got to the water. The lake was perfectly still, black as stone. The footprints didn't stop. They went straight into the water until they disappeared into the dark. I waited for ripples or splashes, but the surface stayed smooth, as if nothing had disturbed it. I turned to head back. That's when I froze. There were new footprints, wet ones. They came from the lake, past where I had been standing, and went straight to my tent. My mouth went dry. They hadn't been there before. I looked around. The trees were still. The forest was silent. The wet prints circled the tent once. Then again, in messy, uneven loops. Drops of water dotted the ground, heavy in some spots like something had stood there for a long time, watching. The lake was quiet. The woods were quiet. But I could feel that something was still moving out there. The water and the fresh footprints glistened in the moonlight. That meant they had been made moments ago. They were made while I was at the shore, while my back was turned. Every spring, flowers bloomed along the path behind my house. They weren't like normal wildflowers, tall, thin stems topped with pale blossoms that only opened at night. I always thought they were beautiful. At night, their petals glowed faintly in the moonlight, and their sweet smell hung in the air long after you passed. This year they came earlier than usual. The nights were still cold, but the blossoms had already opened. One evening after dusk, I decided to walk the path. The moon was bright, and the air smelled of wet soil and that strong perfume. When I reached the thickest patch, I slowed down. In the moonlight, the flowers looked perfect. The petals were flawless, untouched by insects. Every stem was the same height. Something inside one of the blooms caught my eye. At first I thought it was a drop of dew, but when I bent closer I saw it was a small, pale lump wrapped in a thin see-through layer. It looked like a cocoon. I touched it lightly. It was soft but firm, and to my shock it moved under my finger. The petals shivered slowly, almost like they were reacting to me. I pulled my hand back, my stomach tightening. I looked around and realized it wasn't just one flower. Every single one had something inside it. Every bloom along the path had something inside. Small shapes curled within the blossoms, their outlines distorted by the thin, fleshy membrane surrounding them, and they were all moving, not constantly, just a slow, faint pulsing as though they were breathing. The air suddenly felt heavier. The sweet scent that had always seemed pleasant was now overwhelming, cloying to the point of nausea. My head swam, and I had to steady myself against a tree. The flowers, perfectly still moments before, seemed to be leaning closer to me, their stems angling ever so slightly in my direction. I forced myself to turn and walk back toward my house. The further I got from the path, the weaker the scent became, but it clung faintly to my clothes, following me even after I shut the door behind me. I tried to distract myself, telling myself it was nothing more than an odd plant species I'd never noticed closely before. But when I lay down in bed that night, the perfume seemed to return stronger than before, seeping into my room through the closed windows. Around 3 in the morning I woke abruptly. The room was cold and the scent was so strong it felt like the flowers were right beside me. I sat up, my heart pounding, and that's when I heard a faint rhythmic tapping against the glass of my bedroom window. I turned toward the sound, and in the pale light from the moon, I saw them. The flowers were there, pressed against the glass from the outside, their stems curved unnaturally upward from the ground below, stretching to reach the second floor of the house. The petals were open wide now, revealing the shapes inside them more clearly. What I had thought were cocoons were not. They were faces, small, twisted and pale, their eyes closed as if sleeping, but as I stared in horror, one of them opened its eyes. The petals tightened around it like a protective shroud, and then I realized the tapping wasn't coming from the stems or the glass, it was coming from inside my room. The scent grew even stronger. After a heavy spring rain, the hiking trail near my home was slick and muddy, the kind of path most people would avoid until it dried. I went anyway, eager to see how the forest looked in the days after the storm. The air was fresh and cool, carrying the sharp scent of wet pine and soil. The trees dripped steadily, their branches heavy with leftover rain, and the ground squished softly beneath my boots. Not far along the trail, I began to notice how much water had collected. Small puddles had formed in the low spots, but there were stretches where the path was entirely submerged, thin sheets of water spreading across it like shallow mirrors. The first one I stepped into sent a cold shock through my boots. but I kept going, thinking it was just part of the hike. About halfway in, I reached a larger flooded section. The water there was unusually clear, reflecting the canopy above with perfect detail. The image was so sharp it almost felt like I was looking through glass rather than water, but something about the reflection caught my attention. The trees in the water's surface didn't match the trees above me. In the reflection, the branches were bare, skeletal, as though it were the middle of winter rather than spring. I stared at it for a long moment, my mind trying to find a reasonable explanation. Maybe I was seeing a different angle, or the lighting was strange. But then I noticed something else. There was a shape standing among those reflected trees. It was tall and thin, darker than the shadows around it, and completely still. I looked up at the real forest, scanning every direction. There was nothing there. My eyes went back to the water and the figure was still in the reflection, its head tilted slightly as though studying me. I took a step back, and in the mirrored world, the figure seemed to lean forward. My pulse quickened. The water rippled slightly from my movement, and for a second the image distorted, but when it stilled again, the figure was closer. I turned to leave, deciding to cut the hike short. As I retraced my steps, I couldn't stop glancing at every puddle I passed. At first, they showed nothing unusual, just my reflection, the sky, and the dripping trees above. But then I noticed movement in one of them that didn't match my own. A shadow in the water was walking faster than I was, closing the distance between us. The puddles began to ripple as though disturbed from beneath. My boots splashed through the water, sending up cold sprays. But the ripples didn't fade like normal, they spread outward in sharp, deliberate waves. The sound of my steps was no longer the only one. I could hear another set, faint but distinct, matching my pace. When I finally reached the trailhead, I was breathing hard. My boots were soaked through, heavy with water. I told myself it was nothing but an overactive imagination and the tricks of light after a storm. But as I stood there catching my breath, I happened to look down. The mud was deep near the entrance and my footprints sank easily into it. But each time I stepped forward, water immediately pooled into the impression, filling it almost instantly. That was odd enough, but then I noticed something else. The water in each footprint wasn't reflecting the real trailhead or the trees nearby. It was reflecting that same winter forest. And in the center of every footprint's reflection, there was the figure closer. Now its head bent low as if it were peering up through the thin barrier of water, waiting for the moment I stood still long enough for it to reach through. It was late April when I got a call from a man who owned an old greenhouse on the edge of town. He told me he needed help cleaning it out before selling the property. I'd driven past the place before, a sagging structure of rusted metal and streaked glass tucked behind a line of overgrown hedges, but I'd never been inside. When I arrived, the air was warmer than expected, the kind of heavy spring heat that clings to your skin. The greenhouse loomed ahead, its glass panels clouded with grime and algae. Some panes were cracked, others missing entirely, allowing vines to spill outward like they were trying to escape. I stepped inside, and the smell hit me instantly: wet soil, rotting leaves, and something sweet that made the back of my throat ache. The main space was choked with overgrowth. Ivy climbed the walls and coiled around rusted shelves. The floor was hidden under a thick carpet of moss, soft but strangely uneven under my boots. Broken pots lay half buried in the greenery, their edges dulled with age. Toward the back, half hidden behind a tangle of vines, I found a door I hadn't noticed before. It was old wood, its paint peeling away in curled strips, and secured with a rusted padlock. The lock broke with hardly any effort, snapping like brittle bone. The smell coming from behind the door was worse, sweet but rotten, as if fruit had been left to decay in a sealed room. I pushed it open and stepped into a smaller, enclosed space. This part of the greenhouse had no windows, just four walls entirely covered in green. Moss blanketed the floor, and from it rose thick, dark vines that climbed toward the ceiling. Strange flowers sprouted from them, bulbous, with fleshy petals that pulsed faintly, opening and closing as though breathing. The heat in the room was oppressive, almost suffocating. The air was damp enough that beads of moisture clung to my skin within seconds. I stepped closer to one of the flowers, curiosity overpowering my unease. It was bigger than my head, and when it opened, I saw something inside. At first I thought it was a seed pod, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it looked disturbingly like an eye-veined, glossy and unfocused. The door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my hands immediately on the handle, but it wouldn't turn. My pulse surged and I shoved against the door, but it didn't move. The vines on the walls rustled softly, their movement deliberate. One of them slid across the moss toward my boot and wrapped lightly around my ankle. The texture was damp and rubbery, and when I yanked my foot back it tightened, holding me in place. Above me, the flowers began to drip a thick, sticky liquid. The drops landed on my skin with a faint sizzle, leaving a mild burning sensation behind. I struggled harder, tearing the vine loose from my leg, but others were moving now, winding down the walls and slithering across the floor like snakes. I backed toward the center of the room, my eyes darting for anything that might break the door or a wall. That's when I saw it, the mound in the moss. It was about the size of a person, covered completely in green, the shape so subtle I almost missed it. As I stared, I realized I could see the faint rise and fall of its chest. It was breathing. A faint shiver ran through the vines, as if the entire room had just taken in a deep breath along with it. The flowers leaned toward me, their fleshy petals quivering. The mound's chest rose higher, and I could swear I saw the outline of fingers twitching beneath the moss. I lunged for the door again, pounding on it until my hands hurt, but the sound seemed swallowed by the thick, wet air. Behind me, the vines moved faster, closing the distance, curling like they knew exactly where to grab. The mound shifted slightly, and the moss over its face tore just enough for me to see pale skin beneath. Its mouth opened, slow and soundless, revealing a darkness deeper than the shadows in the room. And then, with a sudden exhale that blew the humid air hot against my back, it began to rise.